Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Creation Myths. On January 18th, 2025, I debated Dr. Jerry Bergman on the topic of common descent versus common design, and you can watch that down below. I've put the link down in the description. In that debate, Dr. Bergman made the claim that many creationists in academia, he gave a specific number, 200, he said he had a list, 200 creationists, have been persecuted for their beliefs. They've faced professional consequences for their creationist beliefs or publishing what you might consider a creationist paper in the mainstream literature. I'm going to show you that part of the debate, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So check that out. Here's the clip. And just the very last thing, and then I'll send it back, just on creationists not being able to present this stuff. This is kind of a hobby horse of mine, Dr. Bergman. I think you should, submit an abstract to a conference, do a talk, do a poster. I guarantee you, they would love to have something like this in there, because conference promoters, you know what they love? Controversy. And if you have creationists coming to conferences, like I know that I'm very confident if you were to say, here's the population genetics of genetic catastrophe, and wanted to present that, people would want to hear it and look into it and critique it and whatnot. You would not be barred from that. I think that's something all creationists should do. I think you should all be, getting your foot in the door. Come on into the conferences. It'd be great. I would love to see creationist posters at evolution conferences and talks. Back to you.
Go ahead, Jerry. Feel free to engage any of those points or comments that Dr. Dan brought forth. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting that the 200 cases, and I have 3 forward drive file cabinets full of documentation. Dr. Dan, if everybody was as open as you are, this would be a much better world, to be honest. But the intolerance is enormous, and I can give you many examples of a tenured professor who has her graduate work, her postgraduate work at Harvard University, and she did comparisons between the genes of prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and she found there's no way that prokaryotes could evolve into eukaryotes. The genetic difference was enormous, and she was fired, lost her job. And as far as I know, she hasn't been able to find work since. And that is typical of what happens. And they could not. I've got the hearings that she had. She did have hearings at the university. I think it was Missouri State University. And she had hearings there, and I got a copy of the transcript, read through the whole thing, and 600 and some odd pages, I guess it was. And indeed, they could not find anything wrong with her presentation, anything wrong with her data, anything wrong with her conclusions, nothing wrong. What they got her on is that she had published in non-approved publications. They had a list of publications that were approved at her university, and her publications were not in this list of approved publications, and so they terminated her on those grounds. And as a result, she's unemployed. And this is over and over. Now, there were a few very tolerant people on her committee that basically said, this is wrong what we've done. We have done this in the past with other people who ended up with Nobel Prizes. We let them go. Specifically, the woman who discovered the research on jumping genes. And she was employed there, but didn't last long. And she, of course, won the Nobel Prize for her work on jumping genes. And so they mentioned this, that we've done this in the past, and we're doing this again. Unfortunately, though, she was in the minority, and the faculty voted basically to terminate her 10-year contract, and they did, and now she is without a job. And so you see this over and over, and again, I've got 3 file cabinets, 4 drawers each, full of documentation of what goes on. And so these debates we're having, we can have them on, thanks to Donnie, we can have them here, but can we have these debates at a university? And so many times, now maybe at Dan, your school, we can, but so many universities, you cannot have these debates. They do not want to hear the other side, and they're very adamant that indeed only one side will be presented. Dan, you saw my slides. If I presented that at your university, do you think I would survive? Now, you would probably say, oh, no problem. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that if I presented these slides at your university, if some of the evolutionists were aware of them, I might not survive. And when I was teaching at the college where I taught, I had to be very careful that I was very tactful in not hinting against evolutionary theory, but I was presenting information which we need to look at. And so I survived 42 years
Jerry,
presenting information, but I was very
Yeah,
tactful.
I can answer that directly. That last thing, I'll just real quick, I'll address that directly. So you would not be able to come into a classroom and teach young Earth creationism, because it is not a well-established, well-supported scientific theory, right? And in science, theory is the highest level of confidence we have. But creationists would not be barred from publishing papers, arguing for their ideas, and coming to conferences and making their cases. That's where you push open the door. And then once you become established, then you get into the classroom. The classroom is where we do the boring stuff that everybody agrees on, right? It's in the literature and in the conferences where you can throw new ideas out there. And I can prove to everybody here that creationists are not censored for from putting their work in the peer-reviewed literature, because off the top of my head, while you were talking, I came up with a list of creationists who have published legit peer-reviewed papers in the peer-reviewed literature in the last 20 or so years. I mean, you've got Douglas Axe, Michael Behe, Sanford, Beckley, Basner, Hofstra, Cordova. And then in terms of having dissenting opinions and people who are making very similar arguments but are not explicitly creationists, you've got Dennis Noble, and you've got all of the extended evolutionary synthesis people, all of the third way of evolution people, who are making essentially critiques of evolution that would not be out of place on the pages of like Creation Ministries International, for example. And so we know that these ideas are not prohibited from the literature, but where, look at, for example, Nathaniel Jeanson or Georgia Purdom or Rob Carter, or, the list goes on. Any of these, PhD creationists, where do they publish? They publish in the Journal of Creation. They publish in Answers Research Journal. They publish in Biocomplexity rather than the actual peer-reviewed literature. And the only people stopping them from doing that are the creationist authors themselves. We know they can get their papers published because they have, and they do. And like every time I see, Bill Basner or Ola Hofstra's name on a paper, I'm like, oh, I got to deal with this creationist in the literature, right? So some of them are actually doing it, but most are not. And that's not evolutionists keeping anybody out. That's creationists just not trying. But there's no barrier to, try to get your papers in there. Go to the conferences. Yes, creationists should do that. Absolutely.
You're overly optimistic. The two, Perldum and Sanford and so on, yeah, they managed to get a few things published, but by and large, they give up after a while. I know Sanford, he had a status at Cornell University, and when they found out about his involvement in this creationism, that was taken away. They basically removed that status that he had, and he was no longer able to use the facilities at Cornell University, etc. So, yeah, a few of us sneak under the wire. I know there's a few that do that. But by and large, they don't know where we stand. They're unaware of where we stand. The papers are good. They're published, but they're by and large very few. And I can give you, like I say, 5 books, lots of cases, lots of documentation that indeed we've had many creationists who publish, and the evolutionary community finds out that they published, storm of protest, and the publishers were withdrawn. Many, many examples of that. After a while, you just feel, is it worth it to send papers in that are well done and to end up being rejected? Or often don't even respond to the paper that's sent in. And so too many of us have had too many experiences with that. We've had, why kick yourself in the rear by doing this? Because by and large, Sanford discovered, yeah, he's gotten a few things published, but by and large, he's discovered that they're not welcome. They do not welcome him in the journals. And then, of course, evolutionists brag that, well, gee, we don't publish in the scientific journals. Yeah, because it's very difficult for us to publish in the scientific journals. And again, this presentation I gave, I didn't mention anything about the age of the Earth. Didn't mention anything about that issue. In fact, many creationists are not young Earth. In fact, most creationists are not young Earth creationists. They're old age creationists. I have a problem with that, but that's another presentation. But nonetheless, that is separate from whether or not they accept the creation worldview. And I don't know what percent, but I know surveys have been done and find most creationists are not young Earth creationists. But on the other hand, that's a separate issue. Sanford, as far as I know, he's not. And so therefore they still have problems. Michael B. has had a number of problems. He was lucky a few times. His books sell well. And so he got published by a number of good publishers because his books sell well. But on the other hand, the reviews are terrible. They basically, all the reviews I've read of Behe's books are basically, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's wrong. How did they publish this, etc. They're very, very negative.
Can I just get in for a second?
Sure,
I mean, Michael Behe is still a tenured professor, or what? I think he may be retired, but he's a professor at Leahy. He was never punished professionally for his, everyone knows about his affiliation with Discovery Institute. There were no professional repercussions for him. And he continued, to my knowledge, to publish his biochemistry work separate from his intelligent design work. The only ID paper he tried to publish was Behe and Snoke way back in 2004, I want to say. And then it's all his kind of, perfectly reasonable biochemistry stuff, but he's not trying. I mean, but Oster, Cordova, Basner, Sanford, they had stuff published just within the last few years. You said a bunch of people have, gotten fired. Like, can you name faculty members that got fired because they published creationist papers?
I got a list of 200.
Can you name any of them off the top of your head?
Oh, there's so many. So many.
Can you name any of them?
Out. And it's been a while since
everybody should this is not relevant to the debate topic, but now I'm just curious, like if this is a thing that happens all the time, we should have some
basically all of Behe's rights have been taken away. They have not fired him, but they have a note on the website basically saying that he's a faculty here, but we do not agree with him at all. And you look up.
Well, maybe, gentlemen, if
I think Sternberg,
in terms of the topic, common design. Yeah.
And Donnie, just one thing. Somebody in the chat said Sternberg. He wasn't faculty. He wasn't like a tenured faculty person. I think he was a Smithsonian guy, wasn't he? Yeah. So he wasn't a tenured faculty. It was a different thing. But like Behe, there were no professional, like he kept his tenured position and taught classes through that whole time.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this, gentlemen. I'll jump in. That is a little bit over 20 minutes.
All right, so that is the clip, and I want everybody to notice two things right up front. First was that when I asked, can you name any case like this, Dr. Bergman either wouldn't or couldn't name a single case of like actual professional consequences for publishing creationist stuff among creationists in academia. He couldn't name a case of this phenomenon he says is widespread. If there were actually hundreds of cases of this, where a creationist in a secular school published a paper that could be interpreted as supporting creationism, right? Published a paper in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal, and that paper could be construed as supporting creationism, and then the author of that paper was suffering professional consequences, this would be a thing. We would know about these cases because the right-wing propaganda, industry would be beating this drum forever. They actually tried to do this with a documentary. Everybody remember Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed from 2008, the expose on discrimination against intelligent design proponents in academia? Yeah, that was a flop because none of the cases they talked about in that movie turned out to be accurate. Right? So the fact that Dr. Bergman can't name any of the cases, and there aren't a million examples of this floating around, it's not a real thing. The second thing I want to point out here is that during that clip that I just showed you, I was able to name off the top of my head a number of professional creationists who have had their work published in legitimate, secular, peer-reviewed journals. Those creationists are still doing their thing, right? I mean, like Michael Behe had, the consequence that Behe suffered for being an intelligent design proponent was that there was a little disclaimer at his department's webpage at Lehigh University that said, hey, the rest of us don't buy into any of his nonsense, right? That's the extent of the professional consequences that he suffered, right? That's not exactly persecution. That's not losing their job, okay? Now, on top of that, on top of the fact that there aren't hundreds of documented cases of this, and there are cases where professional creationists are getting published in secular peer-reviewed journals, you also have cases like that of Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, where you have a creationist who goes through a PhD program just to get the credentials, and then they have the letters after their name backing up their lies. In Jeanson's case, he was extremely explicit about that. He told us exactly what he was doing. Everybody remember, how can I use and abuse my training? That's a word-for-word quote of what Jeanson said about his plans for using his PhD. So here is what I want to say specifically to creationists. If you are going to claim there are dozens or hundreds of cases of creationists being persecuted in academia, losing their jobs, being blacklisted, suffering whatever professional consequences you want to come up with, whatever it is, name names. If this is a real phenomenon, tell us who has been affected by it. And look, I don't want to hear anything about, oh, well, I'm just protecting them. No. If the person has already lost their job and has been blacklisted from academia, what are the professional consequences of getting their story out there? Creationists, it's time to put up or shut up. Name names. Show us that this is a real phenomenon that multiple people, not just Dr. Bergman, lots of people in, the professional creationist world claim this is a thing. Tell us who. Name the names. Or admit you're making it up. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all the algorithm-friendly things. I'll see you next time, and don't get fooled.